You stand on the upper deck of the biggest and most elaborate ship you've ever seen. Blue water stretches endlessly before you as you consider all the wonders that the new century has to offer. When your parents were growing up, in the late 1800s, a moment like this would have been impossible to imagine. You, the child of a factory worker, on a grand maritime adventure with the entire family. But the industrial age has changed everything, right down to the structure of the Western economy. And now, here you are. Behind you, your little sister lets out a squeal as your brother sneaks up behind her. You scold him, of course, but secretly you're amused by his antics. As you turn back around, you catch a glimpse of your parents. Your father is twirling your mother across the wooden floorboards like a teenager, flush with new love. You grin. You can't remember the last time the family was all together like this. Together and happy. So happy. You breathe a sigh of contentment, certain that, one day, you'll look back on this trip and smile. You have no way of knowing that, in a few short hours, your whole world will be in tatters. In the early 1900s, a ship once described as, quote, almost impossible to sink, claimed hundreds of lives when those prophetic words were proven incorrect in the most devastating manner possible. Are you thinking of the Titanic? If so, I can't blame you. The similarities are striking. But the ship I'm talking about was actually called the SS Eastland. And unlike the Titanic, the Eastland did not sink in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, it sank while tied to a dock in the Chicago River, a mere 20 feet from the safety of the wharf. Horrified loved ones were forced to watch helplessly as 844 people died, trapped within the confines of the capsized vessel. Approximately 286 of the victims were children. By comparison, only 53 children died on the Titanic. So, just how did this disaster unfold? And why has it faded into oblivion, while other tragedies, like that of the Titanic, have earned a permanent place in the public consciousness? Listen as I ask these questions and more on this episode of History Magnified. I'm your host, Shaylin Montgomery, and this is Episode 1, The Tragedy of the SS Eastland. Our story begins on August 13th, 1903, nearly 12 years before the disaster that would destroy so many. Like most ships of the era, the Eastland was powered by coal, and so some of the most important members of the Eastland crew were the firemen, or the men tasked with stoking the coal that allowed the ship to run. Unfortunately, these men, while essential to the ship's operation, were often treated very poorly. Case in point, the firemen on the Eastland had probably assumed that, during their time on the ship, they would be fed fresh food. Oh, the food itself would undoubtedly be less fancy than the food served in the passenger dining room, but surely it would be fresh. Surely not. In reality, the firemen were given the scraps collected from that passenger dining room after the paying patrons had finished eating. Angry and desperate for change, on the afternoon of the 13th, 6 of the Eastland's firemen mutinied. They put down their shovels and refused to work until their demands were met. It was a bold move. The ship, full of both people and cargo, was left stranded in the middle of Lake Michigan until the captain, John Peru, managed to bring the situation under control. When the ship returned to its home base of South Haven, Michigan, later that evening, the mutineers were placed under arrest, though eventually all were acquitted based on the overwhelming evidence of mistreatment. But it took time for that evidence to reach the eyes and ears of the public. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the mutiny, the captain, understanding that the success of the Eastland, a craft of which he was part owner, depended on the goodwill of the people, spun a fantastic tale of rugged sailors who'd put the safety of civilians at risk simply because the powers that be on board the Eastland had refused to feed them mashed potatoes instead of the boiled potatoes that the kitchen had already prepared. The press ate up Peru's story, quickly dubbing the incident the mashed potato mutiny. But Peru's partner was not so easily fooled, and shortly thereafter Peru was removed as captain of the Eastland. It would be easy to see this debacle as nothing more than an odd little footnote, but in reality, it was a sign of even stranger and more terrible things to come. From the very beginning, the SS Eastland faced problems. The most pressing involved the harbor where the Eastland would be based. To understand what I mean, we need to turn back the clock a bit, to the fall of 1902, when the Eastland was first commissioned. Though steamboats had been commonly used by the military, as well as private industries, since the advent of the Civil War, at the turn of the century the concept of using steamships for civilian travel was still relatively new, and Lake Michigan presented a unique opportunity for American capitalists wanting to cash in on this lucrative venture. For one thing, Lake Michigan is the only Great Lake that exists entirely within the borders of the United States, so shipbuilders hoping to launch a vessel onto this waterway would not have to worry about Canadian laws or negotiating with Canadian lawmakers. For another, it offered Michigan-based suppliers a convenient method for shipping their wares to the thriving city of Chicago, located just across the lake. And so, in 1902, a number of Michigan cities bordering the lake had already introduced powerful ships, like the city of Detroit and the city of Kalamazoo. To Peru and his partner, Leander Layton, it only made sense to bring this same type of financial stimulation to their hometown of South Haven. Unfortunately, the harbor in South Haven was not made for the kind of grand passenger ships that Peru, Layton, and their rivals were imagining. According to author Michael McCarthy, in his book Ashes Underwater, the harbor was, quote, more of a pond than a typical port. At the edges, it was only about 12 feet deep. This was the minimum threshold for safe riverboat passage. The river captains called this Mark Twain. But riverboats and steamships are not the same thing, especially not when the steamship in question has been blown up to the size that Peru and Layton had in mind. Even worse, the channel just outside the harbor was often blocked by a vicious sandbar. Together, these conditions would make it difficult for even one large ship to safely navigate the harbor at South Haven, and Peru and Layton were not the only ones looking to South Haven for a new Lake Michigan port. In fact, by the morning of the Eastland disaster, 4 ships would be crowding the undersized harbor. In the winter of 1903, after the infamous mashed potato mutiny and the removal of Captain Peru from duty, the Eastland received several upgrades. But these upgrades were not, as one might hope, focused on improving the safety of the ship or the quality of life for the onboard crew members. Instead, they were focused on increasing the ship's speed. And, in all fairness, from the perspective of the speed-hungry owners, the upgrades were a success. The ship did indeed start to sail faster, and for several months the Eastland and its crew operated like clockwork. But on July 18, 1904, another fiasco unfolded. one that would haunt the memory of the Eastland and foreshadow the terrible events to come. It was a hot summer day, and nearly 3,000 people had boarded the ship bound for Chicago. Desperate to escape the heat of the cabins, this was 1904, after all, and air conditioning was not yet on the horizon, people began to gather on the deck. At first, the trip went smoothly. But just after the Eastland cleared the sandbar, the ship began to list. Crew members attempted to correct the distortion by fiddling with the water ballasts, and initially that seemed to work. But then the Eastland began to list in the other direction, at an angle of nearly 25 degrees. Water began to flood the deck. Disaster appeared imminent. But then the crew members, thinking quickly, relocated some of the passengers. By redistributing the weight and once again tinkering with the water ballasts, the crew was able to avoid a catastrophe. This was not, however, the last time that listing would be a problem for the Eastland, nor was it the last time that the Eastland's troubles would be witnessed by terrified onlookers standing on the shore. On the upside, the protests of those onlookers did lead to a reduced passenger capacity for the Eastland. After 1904, only 2,800 passengers would be allowed on the ship at any given time. On the downside, no structural changes were made to the ship itself, despite the fact that it was obviously and dangerously top-heavy. And so, naturally, 2 years later, in August 1906, another listing incident occurred, this time with 2,500 people on board. Again, the crisis was averted, and again, the warnings of trouble were ignored. Despite the overwhelming evidence of instability, for 6 years the Eastland managed to operate without incident, even as it changed owners and captains over and over again. But, much to the chagrin of these various owners, rumors of the Eastland's unreliability persisted. Finally, in August 1910, the Eastland Navigation Company placed an ad in several local newspapers that challenged readers to prove that the ship was not seaworthy. Despite the offer of a $5,000 reward, which, by the way, would equal approximately $167,000 in today's money, no one came forward with the requested proof. Then, in 1912, two things happened that pushed the Eastland's rumored problems out of public view. First, the new owners, recognizing at last that the ship posed a great risk to its passengers and crew members if certain safety concerns were not addressed, decided to renovate the ship. 39 cabins were raised, and 2 smokestacks were shortened when the topmost sections were removed. Unfortunately, despite these changes, on July 1, 1912, the Eastland experienced another near miss when it yet again listed nearly 25 degrees when loading passengers. Of course, this incident, while concerning, paled in comparison to the other maritime tragedy of 1912, the sinking of the Titanic. Almost 1,500 people died in this disaster, including some of the most famous figures of the time period: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, John Thayer, and Ida and Isidore Straus, just to name a few. The public was appalled, and not just in the United States. The sinking of the Titanic was a global tragedy. Its passengers hailed from over 40 contemporary countries. It had been built in Belfast by Irish workers with an Irish seaman, Thomas Andrews, at the helm. It made 2 ports of call, one in Southampton, England, and one in Cherbourg, France, before heading toward New York. People from all over the world wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted reassurances that nothing like the tragedy of the Titanic would ever happen again. When it emerged that the Titanic had not been carrying enough lifeboats for every passenger on board, the outcry was swift and furious. When it further emerged that the Titanic had been carrying enough lifeboats to pass legal inspection, The outcry intensified. Eventually, laws were passed requiring all maritime vessels to carry more lifeboats. On the surface, this sounds like a good idea, and certainly at the time people were placated. But in reality, things were a bit more complicated. At a congressional hearing on the lifeboat issue, A. Shantz, the general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, warned legislators that requiring Great Lakes ships, like the Eastland, to convey more lifeboats was dangerous. Why? Because it would make the ships even more top-heavy and make capsizing a real possibility. In the end, Shantz was overruled. To those of us living in 2025, the idea of getting up before 6 o'clock in the morning on a rare Saturday off just to go to a work retreat probably doesn't sound very exciting. But to the employees of Western Electric gathered around the dock at the Chicago River on that July 24th morning, the day seemed full of promise. It was time for the annual company trip to Michigan City, Indiana. The retreat was an opportunity for employees to celebrate with their families, and so the dock was full of men carrying picnic baskets and women carrying babies. Kids hopped along beside their parents, eager to start the day's fun. Western Electric had chartered 5 ships to take all of the bystanders safely across Lake Michigan. First up, the SS Eastland. By 7:30 a.m., the ship was fully loaded. The passenger capacity had recently been set at 2,500, and that's how many people were on board the Eastland when the vessel pulled away from the wharf. I'm not sure how many people were standing on the deck and how many were already in the passages below, but I do know that as the ship swung away from its berth, it lurched sideways. And this time, things happened quickly, too quickly for the crew to successfully intervene. A few lucky passengers were able to see what was happening and jump back onto the dock before the situation worsened. But most were not so lucky. Back on the deck of the Eastland, desperate people, many of whom did not know how to swim, began to jump into the polluted water of the Chicago River, while others, trapped below deck, managed to escape by breaking open and squeezing through portholes. Adding to the chaos, most of the ladies were wearing the heavy dresses that were fashionable in 1915, and the water just made those dresses heavier. In the end, a number of people escaped the ship, only to perish in the open water. And then there were the people trapped on the port side. According to the article Chicago's Deadliest Day by Christopher Klein, those, quote, unfortunate passengers were crushed by the hundreds of people, deck chairs, and other furniture that suddenly fell on top of them as the ship turned. Survivor George Goyette described the scene like this, quote, they came down in a floundering, screaming mass. In the end, the ship came to rest on its side in less than 20 feet of water. But the flooding compartments and the misplaced furniture trapped hundreds of people below that waterline. Welders rushed to cut through the metal hull in a last-ditch effort to save as many people as possible. But their efforts were futile. In the end, as Klein reports, quote, the Eastland tragedy claimed 844 victims, including more than 50 infants. 22 entire families were wiped out. As the title of Klein's article would suggest, it was, and is, the deadliest disaster in the history of Chicago. Prior to the July 24th disaster, the SS Eastland had survived a series of near misses, none of which had been properly investigated or responded to. But surely, with 844 casualties, all of whom had died in plain sight of the horrified citizens of Chicago, someone would be held to account now. After all, More than one witness heard the captain, Harry Peterson, who escaped the disaster unharmed despite the seaman's adage about the captain going down with the ship, chastising the welders for cutting holes into the hull of the ship. As Michael McCarthy said, quote, "The captain showed more regard for company property than people." In the end, Peterson was put on trial, along with the ship's engineer and 4 of the Eastland's owners. But the charge was changed from criminal negligence and manslaughter, which would, theoretically, have been fairly easy to prove given the number of eyewitnesses and previous close calls, to conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. This charge was much more difficult to prove, and in the end, all 6 men, represented by Clarence Darrow a full 10 years before his iconic representation of schoolteacher John T. Scopes during the Scopes monkey trial, were acquitted. It's easy to look at those acquittals and see that the victims of the Eastland disaster did not receive any sort of legal justice. Even the civil court cases did not result in much money being awarded to survivors or the families of the victims. What's harder to recognize, at first glance, is the grave injustice that we, as a society, have committed in relegating this tragedy to the background of American history, while tragedies, like the sinking of the Titanic, remain ever present in our minds. On the one hand, the sinking of the Titanic obviously had a greater effect on the world at large than the capsizing of the Eastland did. On the other hand, only 119 Americans died on the Titanic, while 844 Americans died on the Eastland. So why don't we, as Americans, take this disaster more seriously? The answer, I fear, lies in the shadows. Where many of the Americans who died on board the Titanic were wealthy society scions, most of the victims of the Eastland tragedy were poor, working-class immigrants. There's no way for us to go back in time and save the people who died that day. And there's no way for us to comfort the survivors either, as the last survivor of the Eastland disaster passed away in 2014. But what we can do is remember and tell the story. I'm Shayla Montgomery, and this has been The Tragedy of the SS Eastland. Come back on September 15th for the next episode of History Magnified.